You ready to go?
All set. All right, so I just turned the recording on. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session of PL on the Go, provided by PNW BOCES. I am Greg Fredericks. I'm the Regional Coordinator for Social Studies and Blended Learning. Just so everyone does know, this session is being recorded. If you are not comfortable having your face on the screen, that's fine. Most of you have actually muted your cameras, which will mean that when we do record this and post this on YouTube, your faces won't show up, neither will your names, because the way that Zoom works is that it actually blacks both of them out. So we are super excited this morning to have Star Saxton with us. Star is a great friend of mine, a colleague. We actually went through administrative school together and got our certificates together at SUNY New Paltz a couple years ago. And I've grown so much personally in just the friendship and the learning that I've engaged in with her. And as I said, she's an author. Hacking Assessment is probably her best known book, but she is a prolific writer. And whenever I do talk to her, she's always writing something, just really, really wonderful, valuable stuff. So today we're going to be talking about and engaging in a conversation around portfolio building. I am just going to read kind of our expectations and the way that we structure our room here. So you'll see that pop up in the chat. And before I do that, I would just point out to you, there are two buttons on the bottom of your screen that I would encourage you to use. One of them is the participants button. The participants button allows us to raise our hands and to engage in being called upon, because we are a decent sized group this morning. And so using that hand raise function, if you do have a question, I can call on you and then I'll chime in and Star can then go back and forth with you. You can also use the chat function, which will pop up momentarily. And the chat function is great because if you do have a question or do want to ask something of Star but don't feel comfortable verbalizing that, I'll be happy to read your questions from the chat. And again, Star is terrific because she really values input. And our last session, which just kind of looked at assessment in general and shifting our thoughts around it, which took place 2 weeks ago, was really just based on questions and back and forth and discussion, and that kind of carried the day. She does have a great presentation for us this morning, but like I said, she really does encourage and value questions and participation. So I'm posting into our chat right now our norms, and I'll read them out and verbalize them to everybody. And then I'll turn it over to Star. So the purpose of all PL on the Go sessions are to draw on the incredible strength and expertise that we as a community of educators possess, and to provide a forum where we can share, network, and support each other. Each session is designed to inform, inspire, and invigorate you as we all work, share, and learn together. We will always assume the best of all participants. We will share as no one is the expert. We will participate in the discussions and support others in the sharing. We will mute our microphones when we are not speaking. And again, we are very open to children running through the background. We understand that that happens, right? We're all in our homes right now, or the majority of us are in our homes. But certainly just to kind of keep the noise level down, please do mute your microphones when you aren't speaking. And we will ultimately have fun and learn together. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Ms. Star Saxton.
Morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here. One of the things that came up in the last session was that folks were very interested in portfolio. And so Greg and I kind of talked a little bit, and this is a natural outgrowth of something. If you're considering doing assessment differently, the best way for students to track their own progress and literally be able to see it is with portfolio. And portfolio assessment at the end of a year is a great way to get kids to really reflect on their learning. And there are lots of different ways to do that and lots of different entry points. So I encourage you, as Greg suggested, to ask questions as I go. Stop me if I'm moving too quickly. I have a short slide presentation that I'm gonna share, but I could slow down, redirect, go back, anything you need while we're going through. This is mostly a starter in thinking about portfolios. So regardless of where your entry point is, this is sort of a starting point. I'm gonna share my screen now. Oh, you just say, could you enable it for me since I'm considered an attendee?
You should be able to, but let me do that. Let's see. Ah, there we are.
Good?
Oh, Zoom. You
Oh,
should be
Zoom.
you should be good to go now. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Hold on.
Oh, that's a lovely family picture right there. That's so
Yeah,
nice.
that's from my wedding. So, okay, here we go. So this is going to focus mostly on digital portfolios, but I would also strongly suggest that I know that when we started doing portfolio collection in my old school, I actually had crates in the back of my room, and every student had a file folder, and they were dropping their pieces into their classrooms. And then basically we had that on all of our grade level team. And when it came time for kids to put together their final portfolios for a semester, students went to their advisories with all of their folders together. So this can be done digitally, or it can also be done hard copy if that's where you are technologically right now. All right, moving on. So why portfolios? One of my biggest things with portfolios is that students, first of all, a lot of times with the assignments we give, they are likely to throw things out, not really track what's going on, and lose track of the work that they're doing. So when we do have a portfolio system, students get in the habit of collecting the work that they do, keeping it all together, and also, and more importantly, going back to it to look at their progress along the way. So at the very least, it's a way for kids to organize their learning, even if we don't go beyond that. And for me personally, I've always had a work portfolio and a student portfolio, if you will. I don't know how many of you guys went back to college or grad school as a teacher, and what you are able to amass over a period of time. And not so ironically, as a 12th grade English teacher and AP Lit teacher, I actually had work from my different years of college, and I would bring them into school and be able to show my students how much learning kind of happens over time. And I'd show them my multiple drafts of things, even back then when I was their age. And because I was always meticulous about keeping my work, I was able to do that, and I think it helped the learning be a little bit more authentic to them later too. So it's not only good for them, it's also good for us. And we could build websites with our own portfolios. For example, I know that when I went to do my administration license, like Greg was saying earlier, I did an alternative route, a Trans D, which means I needed to have a portfolio of my leadership experience because I kind of did it backwards. I took all my exams first, a program, but they needed to see my experience. So what I needed to do was create a portfolio that met all of the standards that they were looking for. And what I needed to do was go through my work and think about all the learning that I had done and put it all together and make some kind of narrative that showed my leadership experience. And kids can do the same thing. So why portfolios? To track student progress organically, promotes reflection, it deepens transfer of knowledge, and it encourages connections between past, present, and future learning. Those three last ones, promoting reflection, sometimes it's hard for kids to see their own progress. And again, literally looking at work that they did in September versus work that they do in November versus work that they do in February versus March versus June, there's usually, if not anything, the clarity of their writing, the depth and development of their writing, or their drawing, if this is for an art class, or their ability to understand math and science concepts over time. When they can put it all together and see where they started and where they ended up, there's nothing that's better proof than the visual of their actual work. The transfer of knowledge, which is also really important, is if they're doing this in all of their classes and not just yours, they have opportunities to make very literal transfer between how a skill works in one class and also works in another class, and how those two things can strengthen each other. And then, of course, it just encourages that that connection between things they learned in the past and things that they're learning right now. And hopefully, if they're going to bring these portfolios forward with them, especially if you're working in a system using like Google Docs and the Google Suite, you could have them maintaining their portfolios on a Google Drive, and then it could move with them to the next year. They could just dump it into a folder, mark it grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, however it is, and then teachers will also have access to that information if you share it as a grade level team, where they could see that progress along the way. So before I go into how you could put a process like this in place, does anybody have questions so far about why we would want to use portfolios?
Doesn't look like we have any questions yet, but I did just want to chime in though, Star, because I think that sometimes we think about learning being so static. And I think you really pointed to the idea that it's not static. And at least in my experience, and I'm sure a lot of other people in the room would share the same thing, as you kind of move through your educational process and you get into the higher levels, that reflection, if you have good professors, right, at whether it's at the bachelor's level or the master's level or doctoral level, they're going to push work back to you and ask you to really submit your best work. And a lot of professors use portfolio systems, so it's interesting that we at a K-12 level haven't really come on board with that yet. When we're seeing higher ed at least start to adopt that, but I think you really pointed to that. But
Well,
folks, please feel free to chime in with questions either in the chat or raise your hands. Go ahead, Star.
no problem. I will say, in the school I was in the longest, when I was teaching English and journalism, the whole system that we had set up was one where instead of parent-teacher conferences, we were doing student portfolio-led conferences on those nights. And rather than have the parents and the students go to every single teacher to get a report that they could read on the online portal, we had kids set up in their advisories, so it wasn't their primary teacher necessarily that they were in the room with. And the students had their work set out in front of them, and it was on the student to be able to talk about their learning with some level of depth. And the parents didn't come in to talk with us. They came in to talk with their own child about having these conversations about learning. And at the end of the school year, they had to do a portfolio exit review where they had to choose the work that best represented them as a learner and be able to speak to that. And seniors actually had to go before a committee and present their learning for the 4 years that they were there, and essentially speak to why they felt they were ready to graduate and go to college. And I think it was a testament to that school and how well we really had that system in place for kids to be able to reflect on their own learning and their experience at that school, and really tailor their portfolios based on the subject matter that they were going to be studying in college, how school prepared them to do that work. So when you're starting from scratch and you're putting this process in place, there are a bunch of things to consider. The first and easiest part is the collection of student work. And we kind of put together, the portfolio committee at that school put together the collection, selection, reflection, connection sort of 4-step process for having portfolios ready. And the collection is just after a student or while a student is working on a piece of learning of any kind, there's a receptacle that keeps that learning. So if you're using technology and you're using Seesaw, or you're using FreshGrade, or you're using anything that's collecting the work that isn't Google, but everybody's kind of got their work in one space. The second part is the selection of the student work. Sometimes at the earlier levels, teachers might require certain pieces to be a part of the selection. Maybe there was a major assessment that they want to see in there each term, but I think it should also, the success criteria should be developed with kids about what helps them select. And selection could be anything about what they feel shows the most progress as a learner, most improved. It could be their best piece of learning. It could be something that they learned a lot, but not necessarily. But that's where we really get into the reflection piece when we talk about why they picked the pieces that they did, how it reflects the learning they did, and how it connects to other things. And that's what the fourth piece is about, them being able to make the connection between how this learning supports other learning that's also happening. And then we get them to talk about it, which is the presenting piece. So to go a little bit more into the collection part of the process, again, like I said, as an English teacher, kids are always working on writing pieces or annotation or reading or different projects and presentations that they're putting together. So throughout that process, it's really important that they maintain the feedback that they get. And if you're doing it digitally, again, the one thing I really love about Google is even if they get rid of the comments in one way or another and they resolve them, there are ways to get that information back again. It also tracks their revision history. So if they didn't save the drafts that came before, you could go to earlier drafts in the Google Doc and really see the progress that's based on the feedback they were getting. The collection piece can also be about just, again, gathering all of those pieces. Like if I were doing research and I wanted to collect the various articles that I found, the annotations that I made for those articles, it's a place to keep all of that learning together. Then, like I was saying before with the selection, the important part here is really thinking about success criteria. How many pieces do you want them to have? What is the breadth and depth of the learning you want them to share? It might be different in semester one if this is going to be a year-long portfolio and we're looking at the first semester or the first grading period and we're at a progress report. What success criteria looks like in that selection process is going to be very different than it is in June. And that might even be something you want to talk about as a grade level team or as a school, working backward with what are the end of year expectations and how can we walk that back to each part of the year so that when we're thinking about what mastery looks like at each part of the year, kids are able to speak to that. Maybe you agree on power standards that you're going to be addressing at that time, and each semester then addresses specific standards if you're in a content area. And then you're asking kids to select the work that best shows their ability to support proficiency or mastery around that particular standard. There's really a lot of different ways you can do it, and it depends on your content area and the grade level that you're working at. So again, I'm going to take a breath here for a second. We've gone through selection and collection, and I think that those are probably the two simplest parts of the process. Selection could get a little dodgy in terms of what you're agreeing upon the choices are going to be, but certainly if we have questions right now for folks who may have started portfolios and don't really know where to go from here or have struggled with kids making up the best choices possible. So, Greg, anybody yet? Or
Nope, so we're waiting on questions, but I think you did also bring up another little jumping off point, Star. This is a great opportunity to have those collegial conversations. I know in some of the districts that I've been working with, they've been talking about portfolio systems, and it's been a great way for, let's say, middle school teachers and high school teachers, right, that both teach social studies, but don't necessarily know what each other teaches. They may be familiar with like the New York State framework. They may understand key ideas and conceptual understandings. They don't necessarily know what that looks like in each other's classrooms. And I think that you get really rich, deep conversations about what we want students to be learning and what we want students to know. So I think that that's a great point that you made in terms of connecting with other people we might not normally have those conversations with.
well, I mean, I think it's also really important that when you're working as a grade level team or a department in a high school, when you're, dealing with different contents, like in a math department throughout the grade, you have discrete sort of different content that kids are learning, even though basic skills underlying them. Same with science in terms of physical sciences and biological sciences or the such, where English and social studies kind of are a little more circular, even though there's different information, necessarily different texts, different time periods. The skills that go into doing the work in all of those spaces are definitely just building in complexity over time. You're not really starting from scratch in those two content areas, or language acquisition for that matter too, if we bring world language into that, and various engineering classes as well. You have to have that baseline knowledge. And I think one of the things that I've learned in my consulting time right now is the value of those calibration conversations with teams when we're deciding what mastery looks like. And as an English teacher who has worked in several English departments, when you get 5 to 15 English teachers or 20 English teachers in a room to get us all agree on what good writing looks like, is a challenging task, because when you start trying to figure that stuff out, it really shows what you value in writing or certain skills. And I know for me personally, it's also what has always challenged me about grading writing, in terms of thinking about the things that we can teach students and the things that are innate, and then stylistic things that shouldn't be graded, in my opinion, and creativity and things like that. That's just something we want to help kids nurture, but not necessarily put a value on. Whereas I can speak to them about organization and how easy it is to follow that. I do not know what just happened here. Oh, somebody else's screen took over.
Oh, well, let's see if we can figure out who that is.
All right. It was, I think somebody in the chat is saying it, but I'm gonna go back to mine.
Yep, let's go back to yours.
Here we go.
There we are. Oh, hold on, let me unmute you. There you go. Sorry, you were muted.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, having those conversations, I think, are completely essential, especially if you're looking at a particular standard or a particular assessment, and having common formative assessments along the way where we're looking at a particular standard. And even if we use different texts or different documents, but we're looking at the same skill, and then we're having that conversation together and we're having kids reflect on it, at least we know by the time they leave our year and move into the next one, we all have a very good understanding of the level of kids in general, and their portfolios will hopefully support that.
All right, and we do have a question. So again, will the portfolio be considered a learning portfolio, showcase portfolio? Just if you want to expand on that a little bit again, where the teacher selects the best work, or will it be a combination of both? Because I think some of us.
So this is something that you're going to either decide. If you're doing it alone in your classroom, you're going to decide with kids, or you're going to decide with your grade level team, or you're going to decide with your content, your department or your school. I think all of those kinds of portfolios are valuable, and I think that there's a way to make a single portfolio address all of those different things. I do not think that a portfolio system should just be everything that a student has done in your class. I think it defeats the purpose a little. Have documents as support documents. And when they're doing their reflecting, they might speak of work that didn't actually make it in and why it didn't make it in, and maybe why they chose what they did over something else, making reference to the stuff that didn't make it in, and still have that work available. But I think that there's a lot of value in giving criteria and letting students select which meets that criteria to them, because it's twofold. First, we're seeing what they've actually done. And then secondly, we're seeing their understanding of what we're asking about that success criteria and how well their work, in their opinion, stands up to the criteria that we put together. There is value if you've done like a single sort of wrap it up summative kind of project at the end of a term, to saying that that work is supposed to represent your best work because it's what's come last and you're putting all your skills to work. And I don't think it's a bad idea to say that that would be a required sort of assignment to be in there. But I think for the most part, especially with students who are in high school, that they should be empowered to make those specific choices.
Terrific.
All right, so I'm gonna go on to the next slide, which is reflection. So this is what I think the heart of a good portfolio is, and we should be embedding reflection in all the practice that we do, especially if we're lessening the impact of grades while we're doing this. Students really need to get into the habit of being metacognitive about their learning, thinking about what they learned, how they learned it, what steps they took, why they took those steps, the things that challenged them, why those things challenged them, and how they got through those challenges. And when we think about all of those things together about what makes us good learners, where that productive struggle happens, when they asked for help, if they didn't ask for help, would they do it? If they had the opportunity to do the assignment again, would they take that opportunity to do things differently? That reflection piece, which should be included with each individual assignment that they add, should also be a part of the overall portfolio when they think about their individual pieces and how they actually meet or exceed the standards that we had selected together as success criteria, so that they could tell us specifically why they made the choices that they made, which I think is very telling. And a lot of times, because the teachers are doing all the choosing, that conversation piece, that student voice piece is left out. And it's the same thing as when we design a test, for example, on a specific content area. We're deciding what's important from what we taught. And in doing so, there are trade-offs. We are deciding what is also less important when we are deciding what is important. And ultimately, what that ends up doing is, if students aren't completely clear about the things that they were supposed to be learning, they could have studied the wrong thing. And maybe they really did know a lot about the subject, just not the specific things we selected. And by giving them an opportunity to reflect and tell us what they learned, they are also filling in the gaps of what we can't see from whatever imperfect assignment, task, project, test design that we put together. It really gives us a window into what kids are thinking a little bit more than any one assessment ever will. I could always tell when you have something to say, Greg. You're nodding along or you have a look on your face. So is there anything that...
No, I think you hit on it really well with the idea of imperfect test design, right? We go and we create tasks or we create structures and we think that it's just going to encapsulate everything we want students to walk away from. And I think that, again, you're hitting on something that really has value here. The idea that we're going to get actionable feedback from students about our own task design. And by listening to that and by building in reflection to the portfolio system, you are actually going to improve the product for other students going forward. So it's really a symbiotic relationship. So no, I was just, I'm just eating this up. I love the idea of portfolios. I love the idea of allowing students to find the value in their own work as well. And I think that was a terrific point.
Awesome. So yeah, I think I learned a little too late in my teaching career just how imperfect my own project design was. I think in the very beginning, I was using projects more as assessment. So I would send the projects home with kids and then I'd get them back and then I'd grade them, instead of like project-based learning, which is more like using the actual project as a means for teaching and learning instead of just as assessment. And the more adept I got at building assignments that were robust enough for kids to make decisions on their own and also lend themselves to multiple interpretation and really having that depth, was something that I learned with the kids over time. And, toward the very end of my classroom experience, students were helping me design curriculum also, where we were looking at old projects and really making decisions together about what their learning experiences were going to look like, which, took me a long time as a classroom teacher to get comfortable enough to say, I know that if we work on this together, it's going to be better than what I could come up with on my own. And then, really flesh it out with them in a way that is going to be able to make sense for everyone in the space. So the last part of the whole four-step process is connection. And what I think a lot of portfolios, when they're happening in one classroom, lack is this piece of connection. We don't only want kids to connect what they're learning from the beginning of the year to the end of the year in one space, especially in the secondary space. We want them to be connecting all of their learning from all of their classes. And this connection piece really brings in the importance of shared vocabulary, building that as a team, maybe having specific protocols that we're using across grade level teams, or content areas, whether they're annotation protocols or student discussion protocols, or just different things where we're using the same language in multiple spaces to really help students with that transfer. Transfer is one of the hardest things for kids to get. And sometimes they don't even realize that they're doing the same skill in multiple classes because we are calling it so many different things. The easiest example would be in social studies and English when we're thinking about claims and doing an argument paper of some kind and thinking about the evidence that we're using to draw upon it. You know, in social studies, it might be a claim. In English, it might be a thesis. I know all those words are struck from the new Next Gen Learning Standards for trying to make the literacy language a little bit more cohesive. But there's still many of us who have been doing this for a long time who use a lot of those terms interchangeably, and kids aren't getting the memo that they are all the same thing. Even though there might be discipline-specific language that means the same thing but is appropriate to be used in a different space. So even just helping kids make that connection, where if you do decide to do this as a grade level team or as a school, where the expectation is that kids aren't just making connections from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year to the end of the year or to years past in the same content, but they're also making connections across their contents. How do these two things intersect? How does the math learning that I did this year support my science learning? How does the writing that I'm doing in English support all of my classes? How is the research that I've done in science supporting my understanding of research in English? How do those two things fit together? Often English departments are tasked with teaching those skills, but literacy is a skill that, you know, literacy skills are essential for every single content area to be teaching. And it's not just an English teacher's job to be supporting reading, learning, and vocabulary acquisition. Those are things that we all need to be teaching kids all the time and sort of build that into what we're doing. So what I like most about portfolios is that it makes learning visible, not just to the teacher and the student, but to families as well. The more physical work that we have in a space, as well as the intermediary pieces that build up to the later pieces, really help to tackling math problems and finding that spot where they went wrong, or in a paper writing where they started building those outlines and then developing them over time. In social studies, maybe thinking about their deeper understanding, if we're thinking about the framework and the enduring issues, tracking an idea or an enduring issue from one year to the next, depending on the content that they're studying and what that looks like in different cultures and different time periods and how those things go together. I mean, even that would be an awesome way to kind of build a portfolio around enduring ideas. So you did all this work. Now I want you to sort it based on the 3 most important enduring ideas that you think, you know, the enduring issues that have come up over the course of the year and the different time periods that we've done it. So for the global history folks who are trying to get kids to think in those terms, we could definitely have kids play with the work that they've done in a number of different ways, reflecting on how they fit in different enduring issue ideas and themes that that come up over and over again. So that is the end of the actual presentation, but I do want to open it up for conversation now with everybody and just kind of focus a little bit more on the specific questions that you might have after this very basic sort of introduction to what portfolios can look like.
And again, I would just encourage anybody who wants to ask a question. You do have the hand raise function in the participants, or you can ask it in the box. Again, I know for many of us, it's an unusual circumstance to be in these Zoom meetings, and it is fascinating, right? Where many of us would probably be jumping up and down in a room. There is kind of an uncomfortability in asking questions this way, but please feel free to chime in. While we're waiting, Star, maybe I can just pose a question to you.
Sure.
So we're in business unusual right now. We're approaching the end of the year. Let's say that I want to implement a portfolio system now, right? Just for this last quarter, because we are in business unusual, I want to kind of take a more holistic approach to grading. From your experience and your mind's eye, what would be some really easy, basic ways that I could explain it to students, get students on board quickly, and put this into place maybe the next couple of weeks, so that now through June, students are participating in this kind of gathering process of the work that I am expecting them to do?
So, I mean, I might first have students, again, and this all depends on the age level that you're teaching and the content area that you're teaching. So, I mean, it's going to vary a little bit. From my vantage point as a high school teacher, I would want kids to talk to me like, let's brainstorm everything that we learned this year. Like when I come into like May and June before the very end of the year, I like for kids to really think about the breadth of the things that we've done this year. And sometimes they don't think they learn that much until they sit down and really do a good brain dump about what actually transpired from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And then I'd want them to think about the different learning experiences that they had specifically. And then what I would do is, as a culminating sort of activity, is I want you to think about the learning experiences. And there are a bunch of ways that you could do this as well. You could make a Google form. That's usually how I scaffolded it for my students with reflection to prepare them for the conferences that we had together. Because the way that I did my end of year assessment was having portfolio conferences or examinations of their learning. And if time avails, I'm not really sure if we could do it on here, but I do have some YouTube examples of student work of what those end of year portfolios look like. Some of them who made videos, some who made screencasts, some made podcasts, some had one-on-one conferences with me. But leading up to that, basically what I did was I created these Google Forms that listed all the assignments they did for that marking period, aligned it with different standards that we had addressed in that marking period, and then had a bunch of really pointed questions about what students thought they were doing well already, what work supported what they were suggesting, like which assignment do you think best shows your ability to show cohesion in your writing? Which assignment, if we were looking at development or analysis, which piece of your writing. So they're not taking full 5 to 7 page type papers and dumping them in. They're actually going through them and looking for specific evidence that shows that they understand that they've met it. And then this is the evidence that shows that they've understood it. Of course, I was teaching them to do this all year long. That might be a little challenging for kids who aren't used to thinking about their learning in that way. But what you could do, especially anybody who's teaching argument writing, so if you had to prove that you understand this particular topic, which work have you done this year that supports your understanding of it? First, pull up all that work, and then I want you to go through it and actually highlight spaces that show the depth of your understanding. So kids are actually using their own work as evidence to support their understanding. And that's where the reflection process also kind of takes place, because they might, as they're analyzing their own evidence, recognize gaps. And in those gaps, they might be able to say, well, these are goals I could set for myself moving forward. I really didn't understand this concept when I looked back on it because my earlier work doesn't really support that. But when we learned it again this third time, I could see now that I did get it. So teachers could really just take like taking those major learning experiences, and they don't need to be like unit tests as the example. It could be that project that you had them working in teams and they could speak to those collaboration skills that they learned. They could speak to learning from each other, providing feedback with each other, all of these different things that we really want them to take away with them. I think we'll all agree, as much as we love our content area, getting the content itself is a little less important sometimes than having them be able to look at new content and be able to do something with it when they're interacting with it, and use it in different ways deftly, be able to look at something they've never seen and apply the skills that they've learned throughout the year to be able to take that learning forward. I hope that answered your question.
That did. And I think, and we have a great question from Alberta that I'm going to verbalize in a second, but I think you hit on the key idea. We really sometimes think of ourselves as being driven by content, but, just speaking through a social studies lens, because that's my area of comfortability, we ask students to take content, we ask them to take the lenses, right? That's our standards from New York State. And then we ask them to do one of the 6 social studies practices. And I think you really hit on the idea that sometimes we need to be more practice driven, because the practices are what students are going to see across all content, across all grades, and ultimately are going to be the most applicable to, real life experiences on a daily basis. So a question from Alberta. What are some of the assignments, I think that she's meaning like assignment types, that you feel would be appropriate for a math class? Because I do think that, some of this does lend itself more to the humanities, or we might be more comfortable with it. So that's a
Right.
great question, Alberta. What would a math teacher maybe, how could they maybe approach this process?
So, I'm thinking in-depth problem solving, where kids are really thinking about the different steps that they're taking. And I know now with most math classes that are regent bearing, at least in later years, there's a lot of writing that goes to explaining how they arrived at their answers. So if that's a practice that sort of is already involved, where you're getting kids to write in your math classes all the time, something I might encourage you to do is, as you're teaching them these new functions, you're having them write about the metacognitive aspect of it as well. How are they solving the problem? Why did they choose the method that they did? If there are multiple ways of solving, did they try different ways of solving? And what made this the best one? My son right now is in geometry, so I'm thinking also like proof kind of problems are good ones. Anything with multiple steps, where kids really need to think about how they're problem solving as well as problem solving at the same time. And for younger kids, it could just be the development of specific skills, whether it's numeracy in a lot of different ways, and even stuff that just shows their ability to, be able to use different kinds of problem solving means. As a non-math person, though, I would probably be better off brainstorming with math people. If you told me what your content was specifically, and then we better answer. But like Greg, I'm an English person with a humanities background altogether, so sometimes it's a little hard for me to get into the nitty-gritty with math. It's a little easier even with science for me, because there's still a lot of reading in science, and a lot of writing with science labs and whatnot. But from what I understand, math is getting a lot more writing also, and I would really start bringing reflection into that as well. I know that before math teachers test, there are a lot of problem solving. Maybe word problems would also be really good. So you're having kids annotate the word problem, and then also sort of taking the pieces that they need from the word problem to build the math out of it. And that might be something robust enough for a portfolio as well. I hope that helped. Definitely showing my scarcity of math knowledge at this point, since it's been a long time since I've taken a math class.
And I think that that was great because again, I think we do want to examine that thought process. I could even see if a student was comfortable, teaching a lesson, right, or stepping through
Mhm.
a problem, and really talking about the process, the thought process. Um, you know, I think math teachers are terrific in terms of being able to put something in front of a class and stepping people, through that very kind of sequential science that mathematics is. And if you could have a student demonstrate that, whether it be in a written form or whether they verbalize it, they could do a podcast on it. I mean, there's lots of great opportunities, but again, really zeroing in on the thought that's there,
So
and the approach that's there.
I was actually just reminded too of a teacher that I worked with. I worked with two math teachers for my publication, my pub finance class in my school. And one of them actually had students doing item analysis on exams when they went back through. So they had to be able to link them up with standards. Then they had to reflect on strengths that way as well. So depending on the age, you could even use exams and have kids also kind of do that item analysis, which would be appropriate, and then align it with the specific content that they're learning, especially if you're pulling from multiple standards, which I know math teachers do all the time when it comes to really getting kids to understand those deep concepts, getting them to be able to articulate them and reflect on how they connect together might be something you can do as well.
Terrific. Other thoughts or questions from the group? I mean, I think that everybody is going to walk away here with some real kind of immediate steps that they can take, but also maybe a broader view. And there are a couple people in the room that did attend that first assessment session that you did lead. And I think kind of building on both of those together. And I know that Star, you've offered to come back and make yourself available. Oh, great. We have another question. So question from Monica. Monica Jackson, do we create individual portfolios for each academic class? Should each class follow the same template?
Okay, so that's a great question. And again, it's going to really largely depend on your school environment. In the school that I was in, that portfolio was an expectation in every class at every age group from grades 6 to 12, which it was a 6 to 12 school. So that situation was, we had specific requirements per age level, whether it was 3 major assessments and then one that showed improvement, one that showed mastery. But that's something that you really decide as a team. If you're doing it by yourself, you might want to think about the outcomes and discuss it with the students. Having a similar template across classes, I think, is always the best method, because that's going to make it easier for kids. Plus, it's going to make it more cohesive. You might want to think, even in middle school, what they were doing is they were doing like grade level portfolios where they had to pick something from each of their classes that supported and connected and be able to speak about those things cohesively. So what a mid-year portfolio would look like might be a little different than an end-of-year portfolio. Maybe they're just collecting in your particular class and you have some standards that align with the major one for the end that's going to connect them across contents. So you'd want to look at something that's sort of easily integratable with whatever is going to be happening later, even if there's some variation with it. It just really depends on who is involved, and if you're doing it with a team. I think that becomes a conversation that you have as a group if you're doing it with multiple people, and however your school is going to put it together. The important thing is that you're doing it, and from there you could kind of debrief together about what works and what doesn't work as you build the systems into what's happening. Right now it's going to be a little ad hoc though if you're starting at the end, so you got to really make sure that what you're doing makes sense for what kids know right now. I hope that helps, Monica.
And again, I think that, all of these opportunities or all of these modalities that Star's talking about, it's really, you have to make what's going to work for you and your students. So if you're teaching in a self-contained, right, classroom with 5 students versus if you are teaching, 150 students at the high school level in AP courses, it's going to look very different. And again, I know that we are in this unfamiliar territory, and I think the one kind of feedback I get, and Star, you can chime into this as well, because I always like to, as we start to wrap up, to push this out to educators. You are all experts, right? We are in business unusual, or business as unusual, as we've been saying lately. And nobody is the expert in terms of how to best put out instruction and how best to structure classes and what tasks should look like. But you are all the experts at the end of the day, and you value your students. You know your students in a way that your administrators might not necessarily know, that district level people don't know, that certainly myself and Star don't know. And at the end of the day, there is real value in going with your gut feeling. So as you think about building a portfolio, it could look very different depending on the needs of your students, what you want them to walk away from, how much time you want them spending on it, how rigorous the course is, and how much of that, rigorous aspect should continue in this particular climate. So really go with your guts and trust yourselves, because nobody knows the answers right now. We're just here to offer you these resources. And again, I think what Star would tell you, and please chime in, Star, is that this is a great opportunity to experiment with this. You are going to get value. Your students are going to get value out of this. But then next year would be the time where you would then have some knowledge under your belt, and you could apply some of that to an actual full year of teaching.
What I would recommend too is, as we're wrapping up, I do have a YouTube channel where there is a bunch of student exit portfolios on there. Like I said, for my end of year in class, students had a lot of choice about what they could submit. There was success criteria in terms, and I'm going to actually try to find the document that I shared with kids so that I could maybe share it with Greg, and maybe he could get it out to you guys later. But based on that success criteria, students were allowed to have conferences with me. They were allowed to write if they chose to do it that way. They could create a slideshow and do a screencast. They could create video. I let them do it in whatever way felt natural to them as they were doing their reflections. And again, you'll be surprised when you see some of the videos just how thoughtful they are. And you could probably start to imagine how powerful it could be if this is something that you're doing all the time. And I just also want to preface it by saying everyone that you do see will be 12th graders mostly. My 9th grade students, I don't know if I have any on YouTube. Most of them did theirs in writing. But they've also been trained. So their June portfolio, end of year stuff, did not look the same as it did in November. And I don't want anyone to be discouraged, like I can't do this, looking at those pieces saying, oh my God, how did you get here to this? And just remember, it took me years to get to this place with my students. And as soon as I found a system that worked, it really built into the expectation of what was going there. So just be gentle with yourself. Don't be afraid to experiment, and be a reflective person yourself. Kind of think about what's working, get feedback from the kids, and use that as you continue to evolve with the process.
Terrific. Any other thoughts or questions? So while we're waiting for maybe last thoughts or questions before we do wrap it up, I did share 2 links. They're not live links because that's another one of Zoom's new security features. But if you go to that last posting in the chat, you will see the top link is our PL on the Go schedule for the entire week. And again, I can't thank Star enough for kind of kicking us off in the right way. And this has been a great group and really thoughtful, deep, conversations and thought processes going on here. And again, complimenting all of you in terms of, being student-centered and really thinking about what's best for your kids at a time where there are additional stressors. And again, I think that this might take some of that stress off, and it also might show students really the value in what they're doing. So we have lots of great PL on the Go sessions for the remainder of this week. We have Facing History, which is going to do a presentation on Wednesday. On Thursday, we have the Cunhard Film Institute, which is coming in. We have Myron Dweck tomorrow morning. So we have lots of great offerings. 3 days a week, we do have specific tech offerings. There's a Google Classroom offering this afternoon. We also do coffee and conversation every day at 8:30, which is open to everyone. And that's just really a gathering of people from across the region coming together and just kind of, setting the day off on the right way. And today we had people from as far away as Florida, which was really neat. So that we got to hear from some educators down in Florida. And the second one is a feedback form. STAR really thrives on feedback. And in the last session, everybody was super positive that they didn't really necessarily give any feedback. So those Google Forms, we just collect them. It, number one, asks what would be great offerings to help you going forward, because that's how we build our catalog. And secondly, if you have any thoughts or wanted to continue the conversation with STAR, that would be a great way for you to do that. And you can provide us your name and information, and I can pass that along to STAR because, again, she is super accessible, whether it be through Twitter or whether it be through her website, which is mssaxstein.com.
.com.
But STAR is great and is a great thinking partner and a great, education partner. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I'm just going to thank you one more time, STAR, for giving your time today. And I'm going to also thank all of the participants today for being great partners in this work. And we hope to see you all again real soon. All right. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. All right. Thank you so much, STAR.
Bye.
Be well, everyone. Bye-bye.